Greetings. It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to introduce a special guest to the Center for Global Development's virtual platform, and that's Congressman Joaquin Castro. Congressman Castro is in his fifth term in Congress, representing the Texas's 20th district. He has been an active member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and early this year, Congressman Castro was elected to serve as the chair of a brand new House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Development, international organizations, and global corporate social impact, all topics that we here at CGD are focused on every day. So last year, we had the pleasure of hosting the Congressman actually here as part of an event where we were exploring how the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation measures its impact. And we're very grateful to him for having agreed to join us again today. And the way we like to structure this session is first I'm going to turn to Congressman Castro to deliver some initial brief remarks, and then I'm going to turn that over to a conversation between him and Amanda Glassman, who is the Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow here at CGD, talk a bit more about his agenda for the new subcommittee and what he sees as on the horizon for the international development policy in this Congress. I hope that'll leave some time for questions from the audience as well. If you do have a question which you'd like to pose, you can submit it to events@cgdev.org. So that's events@cgdev.org, or tweet at CGDev #CGDTalks, or you could enter your comments via the YouTube link on which you are watching this. So many different ways for you to get your perspective in, and I'm sure we'll all look forward to that. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Congressman Castro. Thank you for your leadership, Congressman, and for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Masood, and for the generous introduction and for your leadership as president of the Center for Global Development. And I'm looking forward to my conversation in just a bit with Amanda on all of these important issues of development. And as you mentioned, I represent San Antonio, Texas. I'm very proud to represent my hometown in the US Congress, and I'm now in my fifth term. And in addition to serving on the Foreign Affairs Committee, I also serve on the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in the House and the Education and Labor Committee. And throughout my time in Congress, I've been a strong supporter of building our nation's infrastructure for diplomacy and development, including through championing US leadership on foreign assistance and by introducing legislation such as the Global Development Lab Act and the Global Child Thrive Act, which was signed into law this January. This Congress, I have the honor of serving as chair of Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, its newly created Subcommittee on International Development. Under my leadership, the subcommittee will be a home for strengthening our nation's leadership on development and addressing key questions on how we do development policy. The COVID-19 pandemic has seriously set back the hard-won progress of recent years in improving people's lives around the world, as you all know. For the first time in decades, global poverty has risen, and the pandemic's consequences will endure for many years to come. These setbacks only reinforce the need for the United States to lead on international development as a pillar of our nation's global response to COVID-19. And thankfully, Congress has already taken early action, providing nearly $10 billion in the American Rescue Plan for International Development and another $4 billion for Gavi, making the United States by far the largest contributor to COVAX. I worked with my colleagues in Congress to make the case for that support, and the Foreign Affairs Committee played a key role in shaping the proposal. The Biden administration has also demonstrated its commitment to working with our allies and partners, re-engaging in international organizations and reinvesting in international development as key parts of our COVID-19 response. Leading on international development is in our interest, but it's also a special responsibility the United States shoulders as the wealthiest nation on the face of the earth. Our nation has a unique capacity to do good in the world because of our infrastructure of development. And that's something our allies and our partners recognize. When COVID-19 cases in India skyrocketed, for example, in recent weeks, it was the United States that our partners looked to for assistance and our development tools that enable the United States to actually help. The United States has spent decades building up that infrastructure for development through USAID, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Development Finance Corporation, the State Department, international organizations such as the United Nations, as well as to the private sector and civil society. Through the coming Congress, this subcommittee, the one that I chair, will make the case for continuing to build out that infrastructure for development that's so important to leading on these issues around the world. This includes immediate challenges like ending the COVID-19 pandemic, defining the mission of the new Development Finance Corporation, and getting the Peace Corps back into the field. The subcommittee will also look at key questions on how we do development, such as the role of innovation and how government can work with the private sector in a productive and responsible way. I know there's so many more issues to talk about, and I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Congressman Castro. This is a great list of priorities. And let me just follow up on one part of your mandate, which is around the global corporate social impact. And then let's dive into some of those other, what are some near-term examples of ways of working in public-private partnership in the issue areas that you've identified? What are you seeking to learn and do?
Well, for example, I was a strong supporter when Administrator Raj Shah was at USAID of the Global Development Lab, which I thought was an excellent example of a public-private partnership that was helpful around the world, where we essentially challenged both public sector and private sector actors to come up with solutions to the world's biggest development challenges. And we included the private sector, not only from the United States, but also from the countries that were facing these development challenges. And so even though under the Trump administration, the responsibilities of that Global Development Lab have been placed into different buckets, I think that it provided a model for how the private sector and the public sector can work together to take on the development challenges, find solutions to them. And then, as you know, there's a challenge once you find a solution to actually scaling that solution within a nation and then even beyond one nation to other nations that are experiencing the same challenges. And so that's the kind of work that I hope that we'll do more of in the coming years. And it's one of the reasons that we just held a hearing on innovation at USAID and at the State Department and everybody that does development work.
Yeah, we've always been very much in favor of piloting innovative approaches to development and alongside those strong evaluations that have been a part of the DIV model and that help donors like the US and also other donors around the world to understand what might work in this space. MCC is another example of a great institution that has really had a really strong evidence culture in terms of understanding, what parts of those compacts have worked, how have they worked. I guess a question for you is, do you see opportunities to build an organizational infrastructure for evidence that goes beyond these areas of excellence that we've seen in the US development architecture?
I do. I think that really we need to find a way so that this permeates the entirety of how we do development. I think it not only leads to a process for finding solutions quicker, it leads to a process for scaling, but it also, I think, generates confidence by the people that we're working to help and also our allies and partners around the world. And I actually think that we're up to that challenge. And so over the next few years, we're going to set about trying to do that.
Excellent. Well, we'll watch closely. Now, you also held a hearing recently that looks at the non-health impact of the devastating COVID-19 pandemic. What did you learn there? What were the big takeaways from that conversation? What are the implications for the U.S. development agencies?
Oh, as you can imagine, I mean, it's vast. In addition to the very devastating and in many ways the very obvious health impacts, there has been an incredible economic impact to the workforce in many nations, for example. And so
Mhm.
there's a question about how you bring people back into the workforce, just as one example of that. And, you know, we think about the United States, and the United States, as you know, is fairly ahead of the world right now in vaccinating its people. But I remember seeing around the time that we were getting ready for this hearing, a very astonishing, what I considered an astonishing um, projection. And it was a projection of, if nothing else changed around the world, how long it would take some nations around the world to fully vaccinate their people.
Mhm.
And the projection for some of those countries was years out. Well, you think about what that means, not only for the health of a population, but what it means for the economy of these nations and for the workforce of these nations. And so, you know, those were some of the things that we looked at, is that, you know, in addition to figuring out ridding the world of COVID in terms of vaccinations, you know, how do you help an economy rebound? And how do we get back the gains that we had been making in terms of development around the world? You know, the other thing that we consider is international competition. Nations like China have been using vaccine diplomacy, using vaccines as a way to curry favor in conjunction with their Belt and Road Initiative, for example. And so how does the United States remain a leader in helping people, not just in terms of getting them vaccines, but also helping them bounce back economically and helping their people bounce back?
Absolutely. I mean, and what does that imply in terms of like the regional distribution of our aid? You know, we're very focused in the low income countries, which is of course
Right.
appropriate. Those are the neediest people in the world. On the other hand, the scale of the catastrophe that we're witnessing is so large, and you know, we've seen these calls from India, we've seen the response of the administration. How do we think about that in terms of our priorities, and of course the vaccine diplomacy, as we've seen
Yeah.
coming from some other countries in the world? What will be our offer as the
Well,
United
this
States?
is like, there's like several $64,000 questions, so to speak. This is
Hmm.
one of them, right? Is
Hmm.
okay. Well, what's going to be our approach as a nation now that is a leading nation, that is further along in terms of vaccinating its people, that in some ways had fallen behind, in at least in the perception of some, versus China, for example, in helping to vaccinate the world. And what's interesting is that, you know, we knew that some nations would have a hard time, and particularly nations in Latin America, some nations in Africa, Southeast Asia, in terms of getting vaccinations out. But what has also been fascinating, and not in a good way, but fascinating, is
Hmm.
that some of the most developed nations in the world uh, are also having challenges vaccinating their folks, distributing the vaccine, having the vaccine produced, and so forth.
Hmm.
I did make the case, along with others, that we should have a special focus on the Western Hemisphere in the work that we do in Latin America. But the truth is, as we've seen in India, particularly as it's intensified over the last few weeks, the cries for help, that the world needs the United States help. It's not just one region of the world, or even a belt of countries in a particular economic realm. It really is the world that needs the United States help. And I was encouraged to see the Biden administration make the decision that they're going to send out, I think it's 60 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I think that we'll also see more vaccines going out, obviously, as more Americans are getting vaccinated. So that's a very
Yeah.
promising sign for the world.
Absolutely. And as you say, it's looking at that timeline between when we as the United States expect to be fully vaccinated, which is really happened much faster than I think any of us thought even possible.
Yeah,
But if
absolutely.
in Mexico it takes them until 2023,
It,
that's not acceptable for us as an outcome either. So
that's
it's
right.
a really great point. Hmm.
And you make a great point, Amanda. Like, so, it matters to the United States, for example, that our neighbors are vaccinated. Mexico is one example, because there's so much commerce that goes back and forth, but there is a constant flow of people, folks visiting relatives, folks going on vacation, whatever it may be. That's the nation where we probably have the most people going back and forth even on a daily basis. So we have a stake, if for no other reason than our own health, right? Like even if we didn't care about anything else, we have a stake in what happens in a country like Mexico, which is our southern neighbor.
Absolutely. I recently learned that there is actually a North American Development Bank. I don't think they do health yet, but they should really focus on that. It's like the least known multilateral development bank. Let me switch gears a little bit and ask you about the topic of Build Back Better, which we know is sort of a slogan for the Biden-Harris administration to talk about the opportunities to improve systems in the wake of the pandemic, or let's just say alongside the response to the pandemic. And when it comes to US development policy, practices, tools, architecture, are there particular areas where you'd like to see this mantra reflected, Build Back Better?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think there's so many, as I mentioned, I think in terms of how we confront development challenges, when we think about building back better, I think we really need to put a process in place that engages not just the public sectors, but also the private sector, has them work together to try to figure out solutions and then work together to fund those solutions and also to scale them. And I think that's what you're going to see the Biden administration do. In the immediate term, I think, as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of focus just on the raw healthcare part, on getting people vaccinated. But this period that obviously nobody wished for, but has also presented an opportunity, I think, to rearrange how we do some things and how we approach things. And we can put in place a system that works better, that's not only more efficient, but in the end, I think more productive, and has both the public and private sector buy-in.
Yeah. I mean, even something like vaccine delivery, you can imagine Div starting to issue a challenge to understand, how could we have innovative models of vaccine delivery
Absolutely.
that don't just depend on government to get the word out. And that, as you said, Germany is also hiring, a firm to try and help them to roll out vaccines to populations that they don't normally see in health clinics and things like that. So it is an opportunity to innovate. Let me also ask you about, you've been one of the leading voices on Capitol Hill, calling on the administration to look at the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the foreign policy and aid apparatus. There was a GAO study last year that was pretty significant. And I know the administration has signaled a strong interest. They've recently announced the State Department's first chief diversity and inclusion officer. What kinds of actions do you hope to see from this administration and Congress on this agenda? How does it intersect with the way that we do policy as well?
Well, I think they made a great choice, first of all, in Ambassador Abercrombie Winstanley to take over that job as Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. She's obviously well versed in all these issues and well equipped to take them on. So that was a very strong and positive first step. But I think, as she looks around, and I think as the administration looks around and figures out how they want to approach this, I think there's a challenge at every level for trying to make sure that our diplomatic corps reflects the diversity of the country, which is one of our strengths compared to other nations. That our diversity in this country is our strength, particularly when you're talking about sending people out into the nations of the world to do diplomacy. And so the question then is, how do you make the State Department more reflective of that diversity at home? And so I think it's what you do at the entry level, how you get people to apply and come in. We've been somewhat more successful at that than we have been at promoting folks to the highest levels of the State Department, but looking at the entry point and then the retention point, because a lot of people also will walk out the door and go into the private sector or perhaps another government agency, and then the retention part and then the promotion part. One of the first things I did actually, when I became chair of my subcommittee last term, was that I got with Lee Zeldin, who was my ranking member at the time, and we met with over 20 affinity groups at the State Department to talk to them about their experience and how they thought things could be improved at the State Department for them as employees who were looking towards a long-term future at the State Department. And, and they gave us very concrete solutions. For example, I'll just give you a quick one. They said that they felt that over the years, there hadn't been a real effort to figure out why people, especially people of color, were leaving the State Department. If you said, hey, I'm going to quit or I'm leaving, right, I'm going to resign, there might be a 15 or 20-minute conversation with someone, but there wasn't a real effort to figure out, hey, why are these folks leaving? So very concrete things like that that will be helpful. That's not going to solve the whole problem, but I mean, it's a series of things that they've got to be able to do. So I'm looking forward to them taking this thing on.
Excellent. My own mother was part of a class action suit against the Department of State in the 70s that enabled her to enter the Foreign Service. So wow. I'm glad to hear that progress is being made. And at USAID, do you see some of the same issues, or does it require its own chief diversity and inclusion officer?
That's a great question, actually. I mean, I would hope that some of the findings, some of the approaches that we determine at state will also apply at USAID. So yeah, I think hopefully the approaches you'll be able to use a lot of the similar approaches over at USAID.
Okay, well, we'll try and track that. I know that there are some colleague institutions that have a kind of dashboard where they're looking at these kinds of issues, and we'll keep an eye on that as well. Let me ask you, we've talked, the administration has talked a lot about, of course, more robust in global engagement and the role of U.S. leadership and cooperation in multilateral fora and institutions.
Yeah.
COVID and climate change obviously have highlighted the importance of working with allies and other countries around the world on global challenges. I know one of the early hearings looked at U.S. multilateral commitments. What do you think is Congress's role in terms of shaping that U.S. agenda in key multilateral institutions and doing the oversight? And what would you hope, how could we help here in civil society?
Well, a few things. We can make sure that the U.S. pays its bills, right? That's the most immediate thing.
Sure, okay.
We pay our bills. As you know, we're at times been quite in arrears, right, at the United Nations, for example. Also, that our institutions are fully staffed. In other words, that they have the resources that they need. That Congress, its number one job in terms of appropriations, I would say, is that making sure that these things are fully resourced. But there are other ideas, for example, funding more fellowships at our multilateral institutions. Countries like China have done a much better job of doing that at multilateral institutions in the United States. And so I think it's something that we can also take on. So there's a lot of work for Congress to do to dig in there and be helpful. And then aside from the appropriations process, I also think because the previous 4 years had been seen as 4 years of pulling away from multilateral institutions, of a disengagement, right? There could be some debate on that, but generally that was the sense. And so as we re-engage now, I've said that as soon as its CODELs are available to members of Congress, our members of Congress really need to make a concerted effort to fan out around the world and make sure that we essentially act as ambassadors, telling the world that we are going to build back better, that the United States is back to fully re-engage with our multilateral institutions, to engage in this kind of soft power diplomacy, to assist the Biden administration. Of course, they've got their diplomats and they're appointing all the ambassadors and so forth. But the members of Congress, through diplomacy, can also go out there and be very helpful around the world.
Mm-hmm. What about the efficiency of those institutions? I mean, some are universally loved and appreciated by the U.S. UNICEF comes to mind as a fairly uncontroversial UN organization. There are others that have been the subject of a number of criticisms. So, do you see kind of an agenda there around efficiency, making sure these organizations meet their mandate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's another, you asked the role of Congress. That's certainly one of them. I think we should be willing to look at the work that all of them do and make sure that we're holding each of these organizations to their mission. and that they're doing it efficiently, that they're doing it properly, and so forth. So yeah, that's absolutely the role of Congress and the oversight role, um, that we should play.
Excellent. Okay, let me turn to one of the specific issues that you've been engaged in. Last year, you introduced legislation to promote the integration of early childhood development into U.S. foreign assistance programming. And it was part of an annual defense authorization bill, which is quite interesting. Um, and yeah, how did that happen? Why were you concerned about the challenges around kids in particular? Um, how do you see this and the role for U.S. investment given all of the competing demands that are on your plate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess let me give some context to this,
Mhm.
with the Global Child Thrive Act and its emphasis on early childhood education around the world and having the United States be a leader in that effort. First, how it ended up in the NDAA. We're in a time in Congress, and Congress has never been an institution that's really pumped out a lot of standalone bills. But in recent years, as you know, the gridlock in Congress has gotten to where the number of standalone bills coming out is really slow. So there are only a few bills in Congress that are considered must-pass bills every year, literally a few. And the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, is one of them. And so, where I've had challenges passing a standalone bill, one of our strategies has always been to see whether we can attach it to a bill that is a must-pass bill, because we know that it's going to move and go through the House and the Senate and get to the president's desk. So we were successful in that effort with the Global Child Thrive Act. And you asked the question, well, why focus on this? And you're right, there are a lot of different things that we could focus on. Because if you think about what has made the United States stand out among the nations of the world for a few generations at least, is that we have been better than I think anyone at building what I would call an infrastructure of opportunity in our country. And by that, I mean, just as there's an infrastructure of roads and streets and highways that helps all of us get to where we want to go on the road, if you think about it, in the United States, what we've constructed is an infrastructure of opportunity that helps us get to where we want to go in life. So when we talk about things like early childhood development, great schools and universities, a strong healthcare system, et cetera, to me, what we're talking about is an infrastructure of opportunity that helps people pursue their well-being and also their dreams. So that's what we wish for the rest of the world, to me. That's our blueprint for the rest of the world. And the cornerstone of that infrastructure of opportunity is education, is a solid education. And the very beginning of that, right, the first part of that cornerstone is early childhood development. And so that's why, when I got to Congress, not long after I got to Congress, I co-founded with Catherine Clark of Massachusetts and also two of my Republican colleagues, the Congressional Pre-K Caucus, because I really wanted to focus on early childhood development. So that's what this piece of legislation now is going to allow us to do.
Excellent. And I mean, it really is so remarkable. There's now these longitudinal studies that look at like a nutritional supplement given to children in daycare when they were
Right.
2 years old in rural Guatemala. And it made a difference for their educational attainment. It made a difference for wages later in life. It does really seem transformative to be able to invest early. And one of our Nobel in Economics Prize winners, James Heckman, has done so much work on this area of early childhood development. So it's certainly good value for money. Which part of the U.S. aid apparatus do you expect to work on this? Is this mainly USAID, or are you thinking more broadly?
As I was envisioning, at least, that's what I
Mhm.
thought would mostly be USAID.
Mhm.
But I welcome any parts of the State Department that believe that they can have a helpful hand in this.
Mhm.
Hopefully we'll be part of it, because we have to start these kids off strong around the world. And, otherwise, people just fall behind, and oftentimes they never get a chance to catch up. And
Absolutely.
from there, people fall through the cracks.
I mean, and the interventions are fairly low cost too, compared to the enormous return later. So I'm,
Right.
I'm glad to hear that. Let's now ask about another group that's been hit hard by COVID. The women and girls around the world. Unequal labor force participation at baseline, now much worse. We've all lived it. while we were getting on this call, we're working in the same rooms as our children and things like that. So how do you see the potential of U.S. foreign aid to respond specifically to the gendered impacts of the pandemic and the global recession as part of our aid program?
Well, fortunately, I think there's a bipartisan agreement, and you see it on the Foreign Affairs Committee, that there's got to be special attention paid to helping girls and women essentially rebound in different societies. You're right; they've taken a greater hit, proportionally than anyone else in these countries. And remember, and you still have a challenge in a lot of countries where they're still facing incredible biases. And so, we've got to make sure that strategy is front and center in what we're doing to make sure that we're assisting girls and women in these nations.
This is the year of generation equality. I think there was a meeting actually in Mexico City a couple of weeks ago. They've outlined an incredibly ambitious agenda. I mean, what one or two things would you recommend that the U.S. start with in terms of a focus in this space?
Well, first, I think getting girls into school early, and that's why I focused on early childhood education, but getting them engaged in school. And in the United States, when we say that, it doesn't necessarily sound like a tough thing. For example, I just picked my daughter up from her first grade class a little while ago because they were let out early. But remember, in a lot of nations, you still have a challenge of girls either not being allowed to, or for work reasons or other reasons, not participating in formal education. So the United States can be a leader in getting girls into school. And then working in terms of anti-discrimination against women in the workforce. Again, now with women, you have a situation where there's still incredible discrimination against women participating in a workforce, and we have to help break down those barriers. So those are two of the issues that I hope that we can take on in a much more assertive way as the United States and be helpful. And I think that we can.
Excellent. Okay, now I'm going to go to some audience questions. Here's one. If being innovative necessarily means taking risks, how can we get the U.S. government more comfortable with expecting and talking about failure, especially as a means for learning and adapting, instead of trying to portray everything as having to be a huge success from the outset?
Wow. That's a great question. Especially for folks that want to deliver results for a government program, you ask a very great and thorny question, because showing failure is not a way usually of showing success, right?
Right.
Whereas in innovation and entrepreneurship, in tech, for example, there's almost an expectation that you're going to try something, a company or two, a few times, and well, you're not going to succeed at everything. We do have to be willing to do it. I'll tell you that in terms of the culture of Congress accepting that, we've got some ways to go, right? Because people, hey, like, what did we get for our money? We want to make sure that we got what we paid for and so forth. So there does have to be some kind of, I think, cultural acceptance that as you're trying innovative things, we talked about innovation, as you're trying innovative things, that you're not always going to hit 100% every time. But that in the long run, going through that process will be most beneficial to the final outcome.
Yeah, I think one way to look at it that Div has done so well is to show the portfolio. And some things in that portfolio have many orders of magnitude of return,
Right.
And some things not so much.
Well,
but
it's
taken
just like
together.
right.
Yeah.
It's like somebody's personal investment portfolio, right? Like,
exactly.
If you're holding on to 30 stocks or something, not all 30 of them are going to be generating, a 50% return or whatever it may be. There's some where you're actually losing, but overall, that portfolio together, you're getting a healthy return, hopefully.
Exactly. So we'll learn from Div on that. Here's another question for you. You're really off to a running start with the subcommittee, but I want to give you a chance to put out a call to the international development community. It sounds like you're ready to hear ideas and explore a wide range of issues in the development space. Is that right? So do you want to be deluged with the best ideas in development? And if so, tweet them to us at #CGD Talks.
Yeah,
But
we do. I mean, look, we want to challenge, and I guess I want to also not clear things up, but also just speak to the role not only of the United States, but of other nations in helping to solve development challenges. Because I talked about China and our competition with China and what China is kind of how they're using some of their development work to also, help them in their Belt and Road Initiative, for example. But look, at the end of the day, if a nation is stepping up and being helpful in solving development challenges around the world, that's a good thing. If they're investing in solutions, that's a good thing, right? And so we want all nations out there to step up, and then not just nations, but international organizations also, and international players, so to speak, in this space, to step up with their best ideas and to be helpful. I said the United States should be a leader in these things, but it's also true that the United States can't solve all of these challenges, and we certainly can't do it alone. We need all of the partners that we can get to take on what are very deep challenges around the world.
yeah, that's really true. And, the Center for Global Development is based in two locations. We're based in DC and we're based in London. And one thing that is happening right now, because of the very tough COVID crisis in the UK, is that they have had to cut their international aid budget this year. And they've historically always been a leader. It's been, US, UK, Norway. That's the list of the biggest donors in absolute terms.
Right.
What should we say to our partners like the UK that are, like the United States, grappling with huge domestic requirements, but still, have such an important role to play with such a small amount of the budget? Aid is less than 1% of total spend in our country.
You're
Yeah.
right. I mean, look, the domestic economies of our each individual nations, everybody's economy took a hit. The United States lost millions and millions of jobs. At a time like that, there is, somewhat out of necessity, a compulsion to kind of turn in. But at the same time, I think this pandemic, how it started, how it spread, how it has now turned into different variants around the world, reminds us that what happens in one part of the world, especially with a health thing like a pandemic, is ultimately going to affect probably the entire world. And it speaks to our interdependence, and the fact that we need to do as much as we can, on this development work, most especially when it involves something like a pandemic. And, and I was actually glad to see the Quad announcement on what they're going to do in India on vaccinations, and $1 billion commitment there. To me, that's an perfect example of a great partnership. The idea of the Quad started around security, really, right? But now has expanded beyond just security to these other issues, including what I would consider development. And so that's great to see. I think that's how an international partnership should work.
Absolutely. I'm going to do a Quad in Latin America too, right?
Yeah.
Is it
Well,
as strategically important? I know this is not that committee, but I just want to ask.
No, believe me. Well, I've said a few things about Latin America. And it's true, not just about Latin America, but other parts of the world. There are things that I think happen in Latin America that if they happened in other parts of the world would probably get more of our attention. But then also, I think that the multilateral institutions working in Latin America could use a lot of help.
Mm-hmm.
And could be stronger, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And we ought to be helpful in helping achieve that.
Yeah, I ask you that because, of course, you represent a city in Texas that's quite near Mexico. So,
San Antonio.
Let me ask you. We have another question from the audience. It might be that they are playing. Well, I'll just ask you this: how can we promote more pay-for-results approaches, paying for outcomes over inputs, through our federal grant making, especially for international development? A favorite topic of mine. I don't know. How do you feel about that? Pay for results.
Paying for results. Are they asking about a particular program, or is what's the
just in general, I guess? Well, we haven't done a lot of pay for results in the aid portfolio yet. You can imagine applying a pay for results approach to early childhood development, just because it's pretty clear what we want to achieve. Governments also, partner governments might have similar goals. Could we agree on paying to improve childhood nutrition, for example?
Yeah, no, I think that we could, and I think that we could do more of it. And I know that we did some of that with the lab, for example. So certainly.
Okay, that's a good answer. What else? I see. Another example of a version of pay for results, development impact bonds, like social impact bonds that have been used in a couple of U.S. cities. Do you see scope for greater U.S. participation in these kinds of approaches through the
Yeah,
U.S.
absolutely.
DFC or?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that this period, particularly because the world is bouncing back, because it has presented an opportunity that we didn't ask for, but that is arrived to us. We should be thinking of creative ways, new and creative ways, innovative ways to approach development. And all of the different, the apparatus of government, the United States government, whether it's the USAID or the DFC or the MCC, whatever it is, we ought to be thinking creatively about how we approach these challenges. So I'm open, absolutely open to these things.
Okay, I see a hearing in your future. No.
Yeah.
Anything else
Thank
that
you
you'd
for the suggestion. Yeah.
Are there other issues that you would want to flag? In conclusion, what should we watch for in the president's speech this evening?
Yeah, I think that the president is going to make the case to the American people and to the members of Congress on why the big issues that he's been talking about are really going to make a difference in terms of infrastructure and immigration. But I also feel as though, it's just my prediction, but I think that he'll also speak to the need for the United States to be a leader among nations, and for that perception to be clear to the nations of the world. And so I'm hoping that he's going to double down on our work, all this work that we've been talking about, recommit ourselves to multilateral institutions. And I just think that our partners and our allies and other nations around the world, I think they generally trust us more than they trust anyone else. On the whole, right? Not that there aren't particular countries where that's not true. And we have to make sure that we continue to do the work, the good work, so that we remain a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that trust is a big topic these days, and because of the way that the pandemic has happened, and the miracle really that we have an efficacious vaccine, and now sort of what is our response to the rest of the world. So we'll be watching your committee very closely over the next months.
And if y'all have ideas, please send them over. We've got obviously the next year and a half, and then we've got a new Congress after that. But we've got the next year and a half. We're generally going to have 1 or 2 hearings a month, and so we'll be covering all these topics on. It's not just international development, but international organizations and global corporate social impact. So by the time our 2 years are done, we will have covered thoroughly, I hope, all of those topics.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to all of that work. Congratulations again on your chairmanship, and thanks to you in the audience for watching. Thanks very much, Congressman.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.